This is just lovely. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my lecture recital given in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the Master of Arts degree in musicology here at the University of Maryland. My name is Hayden Kramer, and I first want to thank you all for being here today. Events of the past few years have certainly reminded us that live music is a privilege, and I'm exceedingly thankful that we can all share in this experience together. For your enjoyment and edification, my collaborators and I will be presenting a program of 6 works by the 19th century composer and bandleader, Francis Johnson. Now, a few points and questions need addressing before we move any further. Firstly, why this? Why a lecture recital? My first foray into musicology, before I even really knew what musicology was or what musicologists did, was through the organization and execution of a lecture recital during my senior year of undergraduate study. I enjoyed the research and writing processes, to be sure, but I also enjoyed practicing and performing on my instruments. Thus, this is sort of a natural fit. Though lecture recitals themselves are not all that uncommon, formatting one's master's thesis, as such, is quite a bit more unusual. In doing so, I'm endeavoring to show that lecture recitals have just as much, if not more, to offer the diverse audiences of the modern musical academy as a traditional written thesis might. I'd now like to take a moment to thank my advisor, Dr. Patrick Warfield, my committee members, Drs. Fernando Rios and Olga Haldy, the Musicology and Ethnomusicology Division, and the entire School of Music at the University of Maryland for allowing me to undertake this unusual and, I hope you all agree by the end, valuable project. Since I'm thanking my committee here, I'll also mention that there's going to be a period of questions following the recital as a sort of defense, both questions by the committee and by anybody who has questions by the end. That's going to take place in Leah Smith Hall, room 2200, out that way, left, down the hall a little bit. And I hope to see many of you there. So I wanted to make explicit at the outset of this program the guiding thesis questions that I used to frame my construction of it. And I'm doing so for 3 reasons. The first has to do with a sort of thesis within a thesis, that a lecture recital can be just as well argued and well substantiated as any other form of scholarship. Secondly, speaking on these questions now will allow me to return to them at various points throughout the program. Though I've endeavored to craft the most cohesive lecture recital possible, and though this approach necessitates maybe a bit more flexibility and clarity on my part as a lecturer, I think we'll all be better served for those efforts. And thirdly, serves as a sort of built-in accountability for me. You all, as my audience, should be able to look back on these questions following the recital and answer each one both with evidence I've presented and with your own observations gleaned from our time here today. So my first question is deceptively simple. What do scholars and performers have to gain by spending more time with a 19th century black band leader, and what issues must be confronted or resolved in order to do so? This will become clearer as we move on in the program, but engaging with the life and works of Francis Johnson is not all that easy to do. Johnson holds membership in 3 historically under-researched categories of traditional musicological subjects. He is a black musician, an early American musician, as more attention is paid to the 20th century and on, and a band musician. Practically speaking, this means that there is a dearth of all types of information on Johnson, from basic biographical details to insightful analysis in secondary sources. The reasons for why this is the case are complicated, and we'll explore them later on as we're able. To circle back to the first clause of this question, the obvious answer is an awful lot, otherwise I wouldn't have gone through all the effort to organize this recital. But as my brief digression on the second clause has already shown, there are plenty of social, cultural, and institutional reasons why researching and performing Johnson's music is a difficult, yet eminently necessary, scholarly undertaking. The second question is twofold. What questions about Johnson have been answered in past scholarship? How will my project contribute to the discourse, and what questions remain? Despite my earlier lamentations, there are some excellent sources out there. Not 1, but 2 biographies. One excellent album by the Chestnut Brass Company that contains some of the only widely available recordings of Johnson's works, and other assorted books, articles, and bibliographies from which I've drawn information for this project. All scholarship, to varying degrees, must function as a distillation of that which came before. And though I feel that I'm indeed contributing significantly to the discourse, such as by reconciling many of the contradictions between sources and by staging new performances of Johnson's music, I think you'll see that despite my work, there are plenty of lingering questions alongside those that I've been able to answer. My third and final thesis question also has 2 elements. How is my rationale for this program, such as the selection of pieces, arranging, and instrumentation, borne out in performance? What is revealed or obscured as a result, and are there other options? Though I think I've made a meaningful contribution through performances and scholarship to the discourse surrounding Johnson, I recognize that this is but one among many forms this project might have taken. I could easily have chosen different repertoire, constructed my ensembles differently, or highlighted alternative elements of Johnson's story in my lecturing. And this brings me to another theme of this project that ties my three thesis questions together: uncertainty. Rather than claim to have information that I don't, or to know the right answer to many of the questions I've posed here, I've instead opted to thematize this multifaceted uncertainty throughout my lecture. Even considering all that is known about Johnson's life and career from the sources that exist, there is more that is unknown by far. The specific size and instrumentation of many of Johnson's bands were never recorded, so my choices for how to perform these pieces on the program stem equally from both practical concerns and educated scholarly guesswork. Mentions of Johnson's band in many newspapers of his era typically stop at some version of Francis Johnson's band was in attendance and we all had a great time. So outside of placing his band in space and time, it doesn't give us a whole lot to go on. Perhaps most significant and tragic, I think, is the estimation by Johnson biographer Charles Jones that of the more 300 works thought to have been created by Johnson, only slightly more than half survive. All this is to say, I want to be transparent at the outset regarding just how much is still not known about so many aspects of the Johnson story. Now, with all that being said, let's get into the program proper. I've opted to organize the 6 works featured today in a basically chronological fashion. This will allow me to present the salient biographical and contextual points pertaining to Johnson's life and career, alongside the stylistic and musical elements that make these pieces notable. I initially selected all 6 according to the theme of Francis Johnson's firsts. All of these works are, allegedly, for we can't be certain about any of them, some sort of first, whether for Johnson himself or for American music writ large. I hope you're all as excited as I am for what's to follow. So let's begin. And begin we shall with Francis Johnson's Bingham's Cotillion, a short piece originally intended for dancing, which very well might be the first American work of its kind. I hope you all enjoy. The composer of that work, Francis Johnson, was born on June 16, 1792, into the robust community of free black people centered around Philadelphia's Society Hill. Little is known of Johnson's parents, his upbringing, or where he might have received musical instruction, but he enjoyed close relationships with many important members of this black community. Important to note is that following the 1780 passage of Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, all persons of any race born in the state of Pennsylvania were free. Philadelphia became a haven for free black Americans, and this then led to the proliferation of religious and social organizations to support them, including the Independent Free African Society and the Warranted Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of African ancestry. All this is to say that though there is little known of the specifics of Johnson's upbringing, we can still make some inferences stemming from our knowledge of this environment. As a member of this tightly knit community, Johnson would have had the support to pursue a wide range of careers. And it seems that by his teenage years, he was an adept enough musician to secure employment as a fiddler at the city's Exchange Coffee House, formerly the mansion of William Bingham. Now this, of course, brings us back to Bingham's Cotillion, which was likely composed during Johnson's tenure at the Exchange and named in honor of its former proprietors. The details surrounding the genesis of this work are a bit fuzzy, but I'll lay out what we know from historical records as well as my own opinions on the matter. Charles Jones, author of the second biography of Johnson, posits that Johnson's employment at the Exchange might have begun in as early as 1807, when Johnson was about 15. We know from important histories of Philadelphia that the Exchange was functioning as a public house by this point, and dancing assemblies that would have needed music to accompany their merriment may very well have met there. Jones claims that by 1810, Johnson made the acquaintance of the music publisher George Willig on the latter's visit to the Exchange. Willig encouraged Johnson to write some music. The resultant work was none other than Bingham's Cotillion, and it might have been published by Willig that same year. Willig himself was a white German expatriate who became one of the most important early publishers in the United States, both through his work in Philadelphia and Baltimore. If the above supposition is correct, this would make Bingham's Cotillion Johnson's earliest extant composition by a margin of several years, but this early publication date has been difficult to substantiate. For one, in a table later on in his book, Jones inexplicably lists the publication date for this work as 1819. This now is consistent with every other date I've been able to find, including the fact that a tentative before 1820, with the question mark, is penciled in on top of the copy digitized from the Library of Congress's holdings. One of the books critical to placing Johnson as an up-and-coming society musician in this period is Robert Wallen's The Hermit in America on a Visit to Philadelphia. Published in 1819, this was a satire written in a style intended to capitalize on the popularity of its British counterparts. However, in Wallen's account of a cotillion party, he describes the leader of the band at the event as, quote, a descendant of Africa who possesses a most respectable share of musical talents, unquote. I would like to share with you a subsequent passage from the work, as it is one of the most valuable in any source I've yet found for seeing how Johnson was perceived by attendees of these cotillion parties. Wallen said of Johnson, in fine, he is the leader of the band at all balls, public and private, sole director of all serenades, acceptable and non-acceptable, inventor general of cotillions, to which add a remarkable taste in distorting a sentimental, simple, and beautiful song into a real jig or country dance. I'd like to highlight here the appellation of inventor general of cotillions, and Johnson's skill at transforming the popular songs of the day into rousing pieces for dancing, a skill he very well might have honed at the Exchange Coffee House. Given that Wallen's work was published in early 1819, we can assume that Johnson had made a name for himself as one of the city's premier band leaders by at least 1818. Circling back to our initial dilemma regarding Bingham's Cotillion, this is what I think. Stories like Jones's, in which Johnson composes a seminal work early on with little to no documented musical training or influence, are tempting to believe. We can attribute a certain sort of genius to figures like Johnson as early innovators of particular styles, and Johnson certainly would have been one of the first in America to be writing and publishing cotillions if he was doing so in 1810. However, given the flimsiness of Jones's evidence and suppositions of later publication everywhere else, I think we should be critical of this and other tempting narratives where historical evidence isn't all that definitive. Though this means my earlier rationale of programming this as Johnson's supposed earliest composition may have been unraveled, I felt it important to showcase this process as part of my lecture recital. Whether it was indeed his first composition or just a notable early one, Bingham's Cotillion is still a fascinating example of an early American dance through which we can observe important elements of Johnson's compositional style. It will also serve as a point of departure for investigations of some of our later works. After all of this, you're probably still wondering what a cotillion is. Here too, conflict abounds, and there are several plausible origin stories for this dance, with nuggets of truth in all of them. According to British dance scholar Ellis Rogers, the kind of cotillion being danced in early 19th century Philadelphia is likely descended from a French dance called the brandle. This cotillon in French, or cotillion with the extra I in English, began as a dance for two couples, but an additional two were added later, allowing for more complex figures and a greater number of alternated verse and chorus sections. These now four-couple dances were immensely popular throughout the 18th century in France, England, and their colonies. But as the century progressed, elements of the dance were simplified, and the quadrille came into fashion. This is a related, descendant style that was more democratic and easier to learn. The kinds of figures being called were fewer and simpler. Only one or two dancers typically move at any one time, and the earlier alternation of verses and choruses was scrapped in favor of performing what would have been the choruses as separate dances. All of this suggests a widening audience for these dances, as well as a slackening of some of the strictest social conventions, particularly between these dances in the United States and their progenitors in Europe. The two styles, cotillions and quadrilles, existed side by side for a while, but this kind of cotillion dwindled in popularity by the mid-1820s or so. Now this is the score for the version published by George Willig. Like many of Johnson's works, although he would have performed them with a mixed ensemble of winds and strings, with himself playing either fiddle or the keyed bugle, which is an ancestor of the trumpet that Johnson aided in popularizing in the United States, these were usually published in a format that would allow for easier at-home performance, and something like this for piano and flute or violin accompaniment was a very popular choice. Thus, rearranging these piano reductions into full ensemble versions has been a significant component and contribution of my project. Some cotillions and most quadrilles were danced in sets, but Bingham's cotillion was a standalone work. These dances consist of a series of typically 8 measure sections that can be repeated at will to suit the fancy of the dancers. The harmony is uncomplicated, and the melody is simple overall, with moments of virtuosity sprinkled in throughout. Now, as you can see, shorthand for the figures of dancing is included at the bottom of the second page. To 19th century consumers of this music, this shorthand is all that would have been needed. But to the 21st century musicology student without any dance background whatsoever, it's taken quite a bit of research to figure out how these would have been realized. I opted to present just the music for Bingham's cotillion to you today, as I thought it more prudent to stage the figures for an entire set of dances, which you'll soon see. Now, as for the music, we have no idea exactly what ensemble Johnson might have been using at the time of this work's composition, but it was likely a smaller one, both so that dancers would not suffer hearing damage and because Johnson was just getting his career started at this point. For my arrangement, I drew inspiration from an 1848 manual of music called The New England Musician. This book contains arrangements of popular dance tunes, most notably among them Johnson's voice quadrilles, which will conclude our program. This is the earliest ensemble arrangement of a work of Johnson's that I've been able to find, and though it's almost certainly not his own, as he passed away 4 years prior, it represents how other musicians might have heard, transcribed, and then performed popular tunes of the day. All the pieces in this manual are arranged for a quartet of violin, clarinet, posthorn or cornet, and ophicleide, all instruments that would have been exceedingly common amongst both amateur and professional musicians of the mid-19th century. This configuration has inspired all my dance band arrangements, but in Bingham's, you heard not a cornet, but a natural horn. Johnson's publishers occasionally, but not frequently enough in my opinion, left helpful hints as to what instruments might have played certain passages in his ensemble orchestrations. And the indication of horn solo here, coupled with the fact that this passage lies perfectly in the series of easily achievable notes on the instrument, was more than enough of a sign for me to swap the cornet for a natural horn for Bingham's cotillion. Violin and clarinet are a little more recognizable, and though there were some improvements in the technology between Johnson's day and our own, they're mostly the same in terms of timbre or tone color. And then that, of course, leaves me playing the ophicleide. This keyed brass instrument is an ancestor of the modern tuba and euphonium, and developed from the serpent, which is a squiggly-looking late Renaissance instrument that we know Johnson used in his early career bands. The ophicleide was invented in France in 1817, and it quickly spread across Europe and the Americas. So my ensemble, both in size and content, is sort of a snapshot of that, which Johnson might have used at the dances in Philadelphia. The larger all-brass groups, for which his music is frequently arranged, came into fashion closer to the time of the American Civil War. So the decision-making process I've detailed for you here, I think evidences the benefit of my dual expertise as a musicologist and performer. A perfectly capable musicologist, not well-versed in brass instrument physics, might not have arrived at these conclusions so readily. Thinking back to my third thesis question, I think this shows that while my decisions are but one of the options available to those interested in researching or performing this sort of music, my experiences have prepared me well for this kind of creative endeavor. Ultimately, Bingham's cotillion reveals a great deal of artistry through Johnson's skillful juxtaposition of major and minor modes, the surprising moments of virtuosity, and of course, the orchestration, exemplified there by the natural horn solo played beautifully by Cat Robinson. For all that artistry, though, this is a fairly typical cotillion in form and content. It's no less important for its typicalness, but it highlights the fact that Johnson was a practical composer first and foremost. He wrote in the idioms that his public craved, many of them following European models, and the young United States was still looking to Europe regarding matters of high culture, even after its revolution. Now, it wasn't long before the young Francis Johnson, perhaps motivated both by patriotism and the desire to supplement his income, became involved with his city's militia as one of the first important black bandmasters in the young nation. Again, perhaps at the behest of publisher George Willig, who apparently thought a great deal of Johnson's musical talents, he was appointed bandmaster of the new 3rd Company of Washington Guards in about December 1814. Johnson's first military band was a simple quartet of bugle, fife, bass drum, and small drum. It was probably with a smaller group like that in mind that Johnson composed his earliest marches, many of which align with the martial practices of the American Revolution. Also significant is the fact that even these early marches don't seem to be based on pre-existing melodies, European or otherwise. Field books for bands of this period often suggest basing marches on pre-existing melodies for accessibility's sake. So the fact that Johnson's militias were marching to fully American-composed works suggests some considerable compositional talent, even considering the early stage of his career. These exciting original works were infused with local color, as Johnson often dedicated his marches to particular officers, organizations, or events, and they capture the spirit of patriotism that gripped the young nation in the wake of the War of 1812. Perhaps one of the first such pieces is our second work on the program, Johnson's 3rd Company of Washington Guards Kent Bugle Quick March. This is one of 5 works for military band, published as piano reductions by George Willig in or around 1815. And though, as with Bingham's Cotillion, the only surviving source is this piano reduction with flute accompaniment. Thankfully, though, Willig has included indications in the first strain for Kent Bugle and clarinet in the second, so I featured those instruments in those places in my arrangement. Speaking of those instruments, what is a Kent Bugle anyways? Earlier, I briefly mentioned Johnson's prowess on the keyed bugle. These are, in fact, 2 names for the same instrument, an ancestor of the modern trumpet, which was developed by bandmaster Joseph Halliday in Ireland, perhaps as early as 1810. Important to note about both this instrument and the ophicleide is that the keys make them fully chromatic, which means that they can play all the half steps in their range, with varying degrees of intonation, of course. This opened up a lot of musical possibilities for these instruments that brass instruments didn't really have up to this point. The keyed bugle soon made it to the United States, where 2 of its early adherents were Richard Willis, who would become the first director of bands at West Point, and Francis Johnson. It's speculated that Johnson received at least occasional instruction on the instrument from Willis at West Point, and Johnson's musical memorialization of Willis in the 1830 piece called, appropriately, The Death of Willis, is likely an indicator of the professional relationship that the 2 share. Now, we don't have a keyed bugle today, but we do have an 1870s or 1880s cornet very graciously loaned by the University of Maryland's own Professor Chris Gicker in the very capable hands of Theresa Bickler. This instrument is much lighter in character, I think, than the modern-day trumpet, and for this ensemble, it's the next best thing to a keyed bugle. So, 3rd Company has never been recorded, and though I appreciate the indications for orchestration that I displayed just a moment ago, there's no help given as to whether any of these sections should be repeated or in what order. With no repeats, this is a brief 24 measures of music and over in just about as many seconds. Instead, I've opted to arrange this in what's basically rondo form, or one that returns to the initial material after every subsequent section, as you see here, following some of Johnson's other marches from the same period. Whether or not this is completely correct, it gives you all a little more to listen to. And I would expect that this piece would be repeated either whole or in part, depending on the length of march it was accompanying. Similarly, I chose our tempo for it based on Revolutionary War era conventions discussed by musicologist and one-time military musician Raoul Camus in his book Military Music of the American Revolution, conventions that likely informed the work of the militias in which Johnson was participating. So the configuration I chose for my military band arrangements are based on that found in a passage of an important history of Philadelphia by John Thomas Scharf and Thompson Westcott, writing in 1884. They describe Johnson's band as substantially a reed band, with clarionets, flutes, 1 or 2 bassoons, a serpent, cymbals, triangle, bells, 1 or 2 French horns, and bugles to give force or weight to the air, and a bass drum. Now, an account such as this should be examined with a critical eye for several reasons. 1, it's from a history published from several decades after Johnson's death, and 2, it's likely from an external observer and we can't really be sure that they knew what some of those instruments were. Nevertheless, this is one of the only accounts we have, and it's reasonably specific. We already know that heterogeneous ensembles like this were in vogue at the time, and all of these instruments show up both in European military bands and those of their colonies. Though Johnson began his military band career with a tiny band of 4, his talents as a composer and bandmaster allowed him greater and greater range and number of instruments as time went on. As before, I mixed in my practical concerns and limitations with historical context. Organizing a band with the size and diversity of that mentioned here would have been difficult, exceedingly so. Therefore, I aimed somewhere in the middle of this and Johnson's initial band of 4, constructing an ensemble that would exemplify the relative size and content of Johnson's earlier military bands, while keeping it to something that I could reasonably organize over the course of my thesis work. Now, I'd love to play for you Francis Johnson's 3rd Company of Washington Guards, Kent Bugle, Quick March. So there you have one of the earliest to be published original American marches for military band. Something else to note is that this piece might not have been played all that much by Johnson's band after its introduction. As a composer always looking to be on the cutting edge, Johnson was constantly putting out new works with the most important officers or occasions in mind. And especially considering that the 3 companies of Washington Guards were merged into a larger organization called the Washington Greys by 1822, this piece would have only been relevant for about 7 years. Finally, there's 2 last bits of social context that I most definitely cannot omit. The first is that though Johnson's bands were made up of entirely black musicians, they were always attached to white military organizations. There was no shortage of controversy with this, as you can imagine. And though Philadelphia was relatively tolerant, there's more than one account of tours at which white bands complained or even refused to perform alongside Johnson's ensemble. Due both to Johnson's eventual nationwide reputation and the support of influential white officers, there's but a few documented cases of overt racial discrimination as it pertains to Johnson's military career. Secondly, Johnson always insisted on non-exclusivity for himself and his musicians in all of his military band dealings. This meant that Johnson and whatever musicians he wanted could play for any of their affiliated organizations at any time. While I haven't been able to find out whether this was an anomaly for an all-black band of this period, it still serves to illustrate Johnson's entrepreneurial spirit even in the very early stages of his career. So, to sum this up, we have one of the nation's first important black band leaders, at this point just in his 20s, writing original, highly sought-after music for white military groups while maintaining considerable control over the livelihoods of himself and his musicians. Up next is what I believe to be the only surviving document in Johnson's own hand, a manuscript book of music he presented to one of his most steadfast patrons, Mrs. Phoebe Ann Ridgway Rush, sometime in 1820. Phoebe was married to Dr. James Rush, son of the Benjamin Rush who signed the Declaration of Independence, so she was always at the forefront of high-class happenings in Philadelphia. Johnson's band was regularly engaged to play for her parties, and Phoebe certainly must have had a more than passing interest in Johnson's music to warrant the gift of manuscripts. Some of the music in this book did end up being published, but our focus today, the Battle of New Orleans, curiously was not, thus making this rather bare-bones manuscript the only source we have for it. It's possible that this music was never even performed, even though Johnson's band attended several anniversaries at which a performance of such a piece commemorating this 1815 battle would have almost been expected. Things only get more curious when we move to analyze the work itself. Spanning numbers 10 to 16, this is organized as a set of cotillions, which makes perfect sense given Johnson's musical output around this time. The titles don't make any reference to a specific battle, but they do sketch a general narrative of one. We move from attack to combat, and then after some theatrics and more fighting, we have a victory announcement and celebration. My initial rationale for including this work was the fact that it's likely to be the first original battle piece for military band by an American composer. But both I and Johnson's biographers have struggled to see anything battle-like about what are otherwise fairly typical cotillions. Curiouser still is the fact that two different battle pieces for piano that depict specific happenings from the Battle of New Orleans existed by 1816, and one was even published in Philadelphia by George Willett. So what do we make of this manuscript? Perhaps these were early ideas that Johnson decided not to develop on account of the busy life he led. Maybe he knew those other works and thought that adding his own would be redundant. As with so much of this program, we just still don't know for sure. And this piece in particular serves as a nice case study for addressing my third thesis question, as I've had to take the greatest number of authorial liberties with it. So, as to that rationale, I've reused the earlier military band configuration for this piece, and given that there's so little to go on from the original manuscript, I appreciated having all these varied tone colors to play with. Given that, I have ultimate power here, I opted to include some of the calls and signals used by Revolutionary War era drummers described by Professor Camus. These are the general, used in number 10, and to arms, in number 11, the attack. So keep your ears open for those. I also creatively reimagined elements of some of these numbers, as well as a bit of the narrative. The first number begins at a more restrained tempo, but pieces like the attack and the combat move along much more quickly. I also have no idea how Johnson intended number 13, The Bride, to fit within the context of a battle piece. It's formally similar to the others, but it's in A major, which is an odd choice of key for military band music, and in the context of this work, where most of the others are in F or B flat. I chose to imagine this as music accompanying an evening's respite and entertainment for weary soldiers. I did so by relaxing the tempo and using just a quartet of instruments. Most interesting in a handful of ways are the work's two interludes, galloping of horses and firing of the musketry. I've based my decisions here on the speculation that Johnson and his bandsmen were adept improvisers, as well as Johnson's use of extra musical techniques in his compositions. And my favorite of these to tell people about is Johnson's fabled ice cream waltz. Though the work itself is most unfortunately lost, the Philadelphia Public Ledger tells us that in this piece, Johnson will introduce with his bugle the popular cry of the Philadelphia ice cream man in such exact similitude as to deceive even the customer of that faithful public servant. No idea what that would sound like. It is in this vein, though, that I incorporated my own extra musical effects into the two interludes, galloping of horses and firing of the musketry. Johnson included nothing but the titles and simple outlines of melody and harmony in his own manuscript, so I'm hoping to have adequately channeled his spontaneity and inventiveness in our attempts to imitate these sounds of battle. Now, for perhaps its premiere performance more than 200 years after its composition, here's Johnson's Battle of New Orleans. So, though I endeavored to make our performance as varied and exciting as possible, you no doubt heard underneath it all that same simple tonality and concise 8-measure phrases that characterize many of Johnson's early cotillions. The more I think about this piece, as well as the mysteries of Johnson's output writ large, I see this fundamental tension between two incomplete pictures. One is the partial picture we get from the printed or written page of music, and the other involves the limited accounts of Johnson's performance practice that survive in newspapers and diaries. Neither picture alone tells the whole story, and even when we put the two together, as I've attempted to do with this arrangement, there's still so much that we can't know about the magic of hearing Johnson's bands actually play this kind of music live. While the Battle of New Orleans might have accompanied a nationwide surge of patriotism stemming from yet another victory over England, our next work accompanies a young nation's efforts to present itself well to an important foreign dignitary. Beginning in 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette, famed French general, politician, and war hero, undertook a grand tour of the nation he helped to liberate. He spent the week of September 28th to October 4th in Philadelphia, and during that time, there were several demonstrations, parades, and ceremonies in which Johnson's band figured prominently. The most notable of these was a grand ball given on the night of October 4th prior to the general's departure the following day. Johnson composed music both to herald the entrance of Lafayette, as well as 2 sets of dances for the ball itself. These works were published by Johnson himself soon after Lafayette's departure from the city under the lengthy title of New Cotillions and March with the National Airs, etc. There's a lot more. It is unclear why, despite ongoing working and professional relationships with several Philadelphia publishers, Johnson might have decided to self-publish this collection. Through his doing so, however, he had likely become the first Black American to publish his own music. This was the rationale via which I decided to feature a portion of this collection on this program of Francis Johnson's First. Said portion is this second set of dances from the ball. These 5 numbers, published as a piano reduction yet again, also come with the figures for dancing and even some guidance for which figures happen on what repeats, which is a rare treat for the novice scholar of early American social dance. The figures we see here in the middle of the staff are the most thorough that are likely to be on published music. The far more usual occurrence is that like we saw in Bingham's Cotillion, where all the figures are tacked on at the end. If you were buying this music in the early 19th century to hold a dance amongst your friends at home, you were likely already experienced with dancing or perhaps even calling these figures yourself, so you might not even need this extra guidance. With its presence, though, I was optimistic that we could stage the dances for this set, and I thought it would be lovely to showcase the progression from a cotillion here to a quadrille later in the program. However, further research once again defeated my initial rationale. It seems that even as conventions changed as quadrilles grew in popularity, terminology remained the same in many cases. As I tried to discern what these figures would look like, I realized that they're rather similar in form and content to those of the voice quadrilles. Correspondence with Regency-era dance historians in the UK confirmed that these cotillions might have actually been danced according to quadrille conventions. Thus, and also because our time to rehearse the dances was very limited, I opted to cut the dances here in favor of showcasing those in our final piece, of course, the voice quadrilles. Nevertheless, I think it's still valuable to present the music for 2 reasons. 1, these are simply delightful to hear as well as to play. And 2, if these are indeed part of the first self-published work by a Black American composer, more people need to know about this music. To those ends, here is the second set of Johnson's New Cotillions. Delightful indeed, and I hope you all agree. Confusingly, the final number you just heard, Cadwallader, which is probably referencing Major General Thomas Cadwallader, commander of the 2nd Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers, clearly bears the composer credit J.C. Tawes. Tawes was a composer, there it is. Tawes was a composer, publisher, and seller of music in Philadelphia, and it was likely in service of establishing his own propriety that he included some of his compositions alongside Johnson's New Cotillions when circulating them as part of a larger body called musical miscellany. This raises several yet unanswerable questions, including, are the figures for dancing Johnson's own or someone else's? Why didn't Johnson compose a 5th number himself, which would have been the standard practice for this sort of dance? And if he did, where is it? Only further research of early Philadelphian publishing catalogs will tell, but that too is complicated by the fact that Johnson technically self-published this one, even if it was later circulated by others like Tawes. Though I was on the fence at first, I eventually decided to feature Tawes' Cadwallader along with Johnson's 4 numbers, both to have a proper finale on the set, as well as to give me the opportunity to discuss its presence in this collection. One more thing worth mentioning is that Johnson seemed to enjoy bending standard conventions ever so slightly when he could. Though being too loose with these would not suit one seeking to make a career in rather codified social dance scenes, Johnson would sometimes write a traditionally 2/4 movement in 6/8, thus varying the subdivisions in the beat from what was expected and keeping his dancers figuratively on their toes. We'll return to the world of the quadrille for our final selection, and there I'll give you a bit more of a thorough breakdown of how these dances work and how they were understood in Johnson's day. In the meantime, we'll take a detour to the world of parlor music, one of the quintessential idioms of 19th century Western classical music. Our next piece, The Grave of the Slave, provides not only an opportunity to explore Johnson's work in a different musical idiom, but can also serve as an excellent case study for examining issues of race as they pertain to Johnson's life and career. We've already discussed that Johnson was born free into and spent most of his life as part of an active, supportive community of Black Philadelphians. His quick rise to fame, coupled again with the support of important patrons and officers, most of whom were white, has caused some to surmise that Johnson's life was one largely unaffected by the racial climate of the era. For instance, in the foreword to Jones's biography, the musicologist Paul Larson goes so far as to call Johnson a colorless colored man, and he also says that, amazingly, that Johnson was black seemed almost incidental in this story. These statements to me are both intriguing and problematic. Though we know of a few documented instances of discrimination against Johnson, there's little that's definitively known about where Johnson positioned himself in relation to matters of race. Even if more specific information or accounts from Johnson himself were available, it would still behoove the savvy musicologist to pay attention to that context and to make intelligent inferences. And without that specific information, this is about all we can do. Johnson's first biographer, Arthur LeBrew, spent his career writing about important and previously overlooked black musicians in America and across the world. He gives much more significant service in his book than does Jones to the many instances of Johnson's participation as a performer or conductor at various black churches, perhaps evidence of concern for the social and spiritual well-being of the community. The diary of one Isaac Nickel, a white violin student of Johnson's, and from whose writings we have the only account of what a music lesson with Johnson might have looked like, mentions that there was a portrait of Jean-Pierre Boyer over Johnson's mantle. Boyer was Haiti's second president following the revolution and unification as a republic. Both the revolution and Boyer himself became important symbols of black pride and solidarity. The portrait here, as well as several works in Johnson's output, including President Boyer's Cotillion, would indicate overt support of those ideals. Johnson's lifelong associations with members of his community, such as James Forten, who among his other business ventures was an early financial backer of William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist paper, The Liberator, would indicate that Johnson was at least sympathetic to the cause. I think it's fair to say that despite some of the privilege Johnson had as sort of a musical celebrity, he was far from removed from these sorts of social concerns. Now, to The Grave of the Slave. This is just one of a handful of Johnson's works originally for voice and piano. Johnson was much more involved in writing music for his various bands, as you've heard, but he did not entirely neglect the increasingly lucrative amateur market for piano and voice compositions. This is a musical setting of a poem by one of James Forten's daughters, Sarah Louise, and perhaps as a family friend, Johnson agreed to set these words to music and did so in 1837. Sarah frequently contributed to The Liberator, usually under a pseudonym, and this poem appeared there in January of 1831. The poem itself is 4 stanzas with a simple A-A-B-B rhyme scheme. In it, a narrator describes the solitude and serenity of the slave's entombment, noting that neither work nor his cruel master can bother him any longer. Johnson's setting allows the text to shine. He has placed fermatas on the ends of lines and phrases, allowing the vocalist to emphasize these moments and play with the time of the piece. The work opens with an 8-measure introduction, and the verses are separated by a 4-measure interlude that also serves as the work's conclusion. This was by far the easiest work to arrange, as the published version represents how this work would have been performed in its original time. Please welcome one of my very dear friends, Allie Pecoraro, to the stage as we perform for you Sarah Forten and Francis Johnson's The Grave of the Slave. certainly not the very first piece to depict the tragedies of slavery. It does predate much of the other published music I've been able to track down that deals with topics of slavery and would garner sympathy for the abolitionist cause. Thus, I think it's important to note that this piece, composed by one of the nation's most well-known musical personalities at this time, likely would have found its way into many white middle and upper class parlors and music rooms. So while this isn't a definitive first in any regard, I think it's one of the first such works to be marketed and sold to a white audience, perhaps garnering more sympathy and support for abolitionism from those with enough financial and social clout to make a serious impact. This poem emphasizes two important themes that highlight the humanity and tragedy of its subject. The first has to do with the red arrow, the couplet that begins the second verse. The poor slave is laid, all unheeded and lone, where the rich and the poor find a permanent home. This obviously points to the fact that whether a rich socialite or penniless slave in life, we are all made equal by death. The second is the theme of death as escape, one that's well trod by many later works, particularly spirituals. The last line sums this up perfectly. And death to the captive is freedom and rest. Though this work does not so viscerally detail the horror of slavery to the public as some later artistic creations did, perhaps like Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, this is nonetheless an important, if lesser known, musical work in the larger history of the struggle against slavery in the United States. Only one work remains, but it's one of the most exciting in Johnson's output, as are the context and circumstances of its composition. Before we return to the fashionable world of the quadrille, we need to set the stage for what is likely the first international tour made by any American musical group. In the summer of 1837, Johnson began making both personal and professional preparations for a trip to Europe. He sought to absorb all the most fashionable musical goings-on there before returning to his American publics, which still place all things European at the apex of their cultural hierarchies. This is supported by the Public Ledger, which at first asked, what, in Johnson's absence, quote, will our military corps do for parade music? And what will our dancers do without Frank's enlivening band, unquote. The author concluded by saying, Frank's object was a good one. He was going to Europe to improve his musical knowledge, to cultivate his musical taste, and learn airs still more delightful and pleasing. And doubtless he would return in 12 months in all respects qualified, even in a greater degree than formerly, to contribute to the gratification of the public. These passages reflect the importance of Johnson and his bands to the fabric of Philadelphia life. Johnson was, of course, not the only band leader active at this time, but his bands were far and away the most well-reputed in the city. This, too, is reinforced by the handful of benefit balls that were held to raise funds for this excursion. Johnson's publics were invested in his musical improvement. And so, after leaving his bands and professional affairs in the capable hands of his wife, Helen, Francis Johnson and four of his most adept musicians departed for England in early November, and notices for their concerts were appearing in London papers by mid-December. Lest we forget, however, that the driving force behind this excursion was not the giving of concerts, but the hearing of them. By the early 1830s, the showman conductor Philippe Moussard was giving concerts of light and dance music in Paris. Important to note is that though dance music was being presented, it was for listening, most times, rather than actual dancing. Moussard was seeking to appeal not to the sort of audience that would attend symphonies, but one that would frequent the theater just as readily as it would the circus. Thus, he crafted a concert environment where patrons could enjoy pleasant music under pleasant circumstances. These would eventually become known as promenade concerts, and they spread quickly throughout Europe. Whether in London or on an unverifiable trip to France, Johnson heard these and was apparently inspired. He would present programs modeled on these concerts both in Philadelphia and elsewhere to great success following his return to the United States late in 1838. The musical work most emblematic of Johnson's European encounter are his voice quadrilles. And the header here tells us that they had to be composed, at least in part, during his time there, as it mentions, performed in London. This is a set of quadrilles, as was custom, featuring 5 numbers in this typical sequence. However, I think it's what's not typical that makes this work so important and so memorable, both for us now and in the minds of Johnson's audiences. Figures for dancing are indeed included with the piano reduction, the very same figures our talented dancers will be showcasing for you today. Though this work was almost certainly performed both with dancers and without at various times, the latter being the promenade style. You might recall from much earlier that I mentioned another arrangement of this work, that being found in the New England Musician. This is the only work on the program for which there are not one but 2 source versions. I modeled my dance band instrumentation on the New England Musician configuration, but my voice quadrilles arrangement was equally inspired by both these source versions. In cases of conflict, I opted to give primacy to the piano reduction. Though Johnson himself probably wasn't responsible for the engraving of it, it was still completed during his lifetime, whereas the New England musician was not. Furthermore, the arrangement found there was likely made by band musicians who heard a group, either Johnson's or another, play these quadrilles, as there are some differences that are most readily explained as errors in transcription. It was a wonderful exercise for me to sit down with both versions and craft my own that I hope captures some of the excitement that Johnson's audiences would have felt at hearing these quadrilles. Dancers, find your partners, and all of you please enjoy, with the published figures, Francis Johnson's celebrated and much admired voice quadrilles.
If you will dance, we will sing, and the merry bell shall ring. If you will dance, we will sing, and the merry bell shall ring.
Now, I'm sure that the singing for which these quadrilles are named did not escape your notice. The initial rationale for this work's inclusion on the program was that it was likely the first quadrille to feature voices in a traditionally instrumental idiom. Johnson's first two numbers, and though I think they're quite catchy and feature some excellent solos, are basically straight-ahead examples of Le Pantalon and L'été, the typical first two movements of a set of quadrilles. Numbers 3 through 5 are anything but typical. And we are about out of time, so if you want to hear more about why there's not typical, please come to the defense in Leah Smith Hall immediately following. So, that being said, I would like to conclude our time together by checking my work, so to speak, revisiting the thesis questions with which I opened the program and have referred to throughout. My answers to these are less important than those conclusions that you all, my audience, draw for yourselves based on what you've learned today. To my first question, I hope you've seen that there's an awful lot to be gained from spending this kind of time with a historically under-researched subject. We've heard new performances of his works and connected the dots between sources to figure out likely explanations for important musical and social developments, but that's just the first step. There's so much more that we don't know, and I think I've made that clear as well. I phrase this question this way rather than from spending time with Francis Johnson to highlight not just the historically under-researched categories that Johnson and so many other musicians of the past occupied, but to illuminate a point that has become clearer to me the longer I've spent doing this research. Johnson is personally notable for many reasons, to be sure, but I want to draw attention to all the reasons in which he isn't. He likely didn't set out to be the first Black American to publish music or to be published. He was simply making a living for himself via the skills he honed and the institutions accessible to him. He didn't learn the keyed bugle with the intent of becoming one of the first virtuoso players of the instrument in the United States. He likely did so to capitalize on an invention that might become popular in the world of martial music. He didn't set out to lead the first American musical tour of Europe. He was striving to stay fashionable in the popular music scenes of his day, even as he grew older. These and other reasons for which we can regard Johnson as historically notable almost 200 years later were, for him, just simple facts of life, facts necessary for making a living as a popular musician. Johnson is not alone in this, of course. Many historical musicians deserve to be examined with this kind of lens. Now to my second question. We have Arthur LeBrew and Charles Jones to thank for fantastic biographies of Johnson. They did the hard work of piecing together his life story from newspapers, church records, publisher catalogs, and other writings. The Chestnut Brass albums provide a readily accessible source for hearing one kind of realization of Johnson's music, and the other supporting sources on dance, military music, and 19th century Philadelphia life were all critical in the realization of this project. I think in this project today, I've made a dual intervention via the medium of lecture-recital in the discourse on Johnson, and perhaps most importantly, I hope to have presented an enjoyable artistic product for you all today. And now for the third question. My thematization of transparency all throughout this program is not just an end unto itself, but is also a response to all of those yet unanswerable questions. For the selection of pieces, I of course started with the theme of Francis Johnson's firsts, yet subsequent research has put up for question nearly all of these works' status as the firsts that I thought them to be. Even with that uncertainty and controversy, I still had a recital to put on. Thus, my rationale for these arrangements were informed by historical examples as much as by practical considerations. The amount of freedom I had, creative freedom I had, when it came to programming, arranging, lecturing, and playing was both a blessing in that there was little in terms of restrictions, and a curse in that there was little in terms of restrictions. In cases like this, where so much is unknown, and true restrictions are few, I think that we scholars should certainly endeavor to be honest and transparent in our rationale and methodologies. There are way too many people to thank for a program like this, and it is 6:33, so we need to get going. But please join me in thanking all of these people now, and I hope you enjoy.